Israel's leadership is increasingly beginning to understand that the previous model of international support is gradually changing. What for decades was viewed as a stable foundation of Middle Eastern politics is now going through a serious test of durability. While tensions around Iran continue to grow and unmanned aerial systems once again dominate global headlines, the United States administration has started demonstrating a far more cautious approach to the situation. Against the backdrop of domestic protests, rising fuel prices, and intensifying political competition inside the country, Washington is increasingly prioritizing diplomatic mechanisms instead of direct involvement. That is why, over the past several weeks, more and more observers have begun asking the same question. Why did the United States start distancing itself from the toughest regional scenarios at the most sensitive moment? And how did internal economic and electoral concerns become more important for the White House than its previous strategic commitments? Dear viewers, you are on the channel Info Vector. With you is Daniel Brooks, and today we will take a detailed look at the changes that are beginning to reshape the relationship between Israel, Iran, and the United States. By the middle of April, it became increasingly clear that the political configuration of the region was changing much faster than many expected. What still looked like a coordinated Washington-Tel Aviv strategy toward Iran at the end of winter began to appear very different only weeks later. The main signal coming from Washington after the temporary reduction in tensions was relatively straightforward. The United States is not interested in a major expansion of the confrontation around Iran, especially if such developments begin affecting the global economy and domestic stability inside America itself. The reasons behind this position are largely tied to internal political realities. As elections continue approaching, Donald Trump's administration has discovered that the Middle Eastern agenda no longer produces the same unifying effect inside the country. On the contrary, American voters are increasingly questioning national priorities. Across the American media landscape, discussions about fuel prices, inflation, rising logistics costs, and unstable global markets have become more dominant than geopolitical rhetoric. As a result, officials in Washington have increasingly shifted their language away from escalation and toward containment. At the same time, another important theme has become more visible: strategic fatigue. Over recent years, the United States has already committed substantial resources across multiple international directions, while attention toward competition with China in the Pacific region continues to grow. As a result, the Middle East is increasingly being viewed by part of the American establishment as an extremely expensive theater in terms of logistics, resources, and domestic political stability. The shift in rhetoric became especially noticeable. Earlier statements from Washington focused heavily on eliminating long-term risks connected to Iran. But by late April, language surrounding dialogue, restraint, and diplomatic communication became far more common. Additional attention was drawn to reports suggesting possible contacts between American and Iranian representatives in Oman. According to various analytical sources, the discussions may have involved energy stability, maritime security, and ways to reduce the overall level of regional tension. For Israel, these signals became highly sensitive. In Tel Aviv, concerns grew that Israeli interests could gradually become part of a much larger global arrangement centered around trade routes, energy flows, and market stability. To understand why these shifts are happening, it is important to examine the energy factor itself. Oil and logistics now play a central role in shaping the decisions of major powers. While Israel continued requesting additional support for its air defense systems, American analysts were increasingly calculating risks to domestic supply chains and the U.S. economy. Iran, meanwhile, appeared to focus not only on regional influence but also on economic leverage through global maritime routes. Following statements regarding possible restrictions near the Strait of Hormuz, global markets reacted with growing concern. By roughly the third week of April, oil prices had climbed significantly, while international financial markets showed heightened volatility. For the United States, which is still attempting to keep inflation under control, such developments represented a serious challenge. Officials in Washington became increasingly worried that further deterioration could lead to rising fuel costs, more expensive logistics, and growing pressure on food prices across the country. And those developments directly affect public opinion and approval ratings. Against this backdrop, the White House gradually increased diplomatic pressure on Israel, encouraging a more restrained approach toward actions that could further destabilize the region. In practice, a new logic appears to be emerging in Washington. Preserving global market stability is becoming just as important as previous geopolitical commitments. That is precisely why reports about negotiations in Oman attracted so much attention. According to several sources, discussions may have involved partial de-escalation measures in exchange for guarantees regarding maritime security and limitations on further regional expansion of the crisis. For Israel, such signals became a troubling indication that Washington was transitioning toward a more pragmatic strategic model. At the same time, reports began surfacing regarding delays in the delivery of certain categories of military equipment and technical components. Officially, these delays were linked to licensing procedures, inspections, and administrative reviews. However, inside Israeli political circles, many interpreted them as a form of indirect pressure. Particular attention focused on components connected to aviation systems and missile defense infrastructure. Israel's security architecture has long depended on rapid logistics and uninterrupted support from the United States. But by late April, the pace of those deliveries had noticeably slowed. As a result, Israeli structures were forced to move toward more careful resource allocation. Some analysts believe Washington is demonstrating that logistics itself can now be used as a political instrument. The United States, however, continues avoiding dramatic public announcements or formal restrictions. Instead, it appears to be relying on a softer and more controlled mechanism, expanding review procedures, compliance checks, and licensing requirements. For Israel, this became a serious reminder that modern security depends heavily on the stability of supply chains. At the same time, the internal situation inside America remains equally important. In recent weeks, protest activity across the United States has intensified considerably. Large demonstrations have appeared across several major cities and universities. Part of American society increasingly opposes deeper involvement in Middle Eastern affairs, arguing that Washington should focus primarily on domestic issues. With elections approaching, this creates additional pressure for the White House. Support for Israel is gradually becoming less of a universal political consensus. Inside Congress, new initiatives related to military assistance oversight and restrictions on foreign weapons transfers are appearing more frequently. For the Trump administration, maintaining an image of stability inside the country has become critically important. That is why the White House appears increasingly determined to avoid scenarios capable of triggering another major spike in oil prices and economic instability. By late April, it became clear that Washington was attempting to preserve alliance relations with Israel while simultaneously preventing a broader regional escalation. But for Tel Aviv, this balancing act looks increasingly difficult. Israel is gradually finding itself in a position where more decisions must rely primarily on its own resources and capabilities. Today, more and more analysts argue that the Middle East is entering an entirely new phase, one where even the strongest alliances become increasingly pragmatic and dependent on economic realities. The overall picture now appears highly revealing. The first possible scenario is that Israel continues pursuing a very firm strategic course while attempting to preserve decision-making independence despite reduced external support. The second scenario involves a transition toward a prolonged period of limited confrontation combined with diplomatic containment. The third option centers around attempts to build new regional partnerships with Middle Eastern states that are also concerned about Washington's changing posture. The main conclusion of recent weeks is that global politics is becoming increasingly dependent on domestic economics, energy markets, and public opinion. For Israel, a period of difficult strategic decisions is now beginning. Nearly every future step will require more careful calculations regarding logistics, resources, and international backing. Washington, meanwhile, appears increasingly focused on its own internal priorities, the economy, elections, and social stability. And that means the previous model of unconditional support may gradually be fading into the past. The world is changing, and the Middle East is becoming one of the clearest examples of how quickly even long-standing geopolitical structures can transform. What do you think? Will Israel be able to adapt to this new reality and preserve strategic stability without the same level of American support? This was Daniel Brooks. See you in the next Analytical Reviews.